Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a great Friday. Today, I wanted to talk about rules for perspective. And kind of all week, I was thinking about perspective and just if there was any information about perspective. And so I found this article, Rules for Perspective, which I thought was just excellent. There's the link, which I'll include in the description. It's taken from Christopher W. Tyler, PhD. He's a professor in the Division of Optometry at the City University of London, the Smith-Kettlewell Eye Research Institute. So I'm guessing he pretty well knows what he's talking about, right? So my joke for this week: a physicist sees a young man standing on the top of a building. Stay tuned for the rest of it. A physicist sees a young man standing at the top of a building. So the introduction to this, you can see the photograph here. Linear perspective has a history going back at least to Aristarchus, a scene painter for Iseclius, if that's the way you pronounce it, in the 4th century BC. 3-point perspective, that if you check, there's 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point. 3-point perspective did not come into widespread use until well after the invention of photography, when the flexible availability of tilted camera angles revealed its visual effectiveness. Now you have to remember that for the most part, perspective has to do with painting or drawing, and then now in the modern days, photography, and so forth. So let's talk about some of the rules for perspective. This is a whole lot of information, so I hope you can keep up. There's only one geometry of perspective: projection onto a fixed picture plane. So perspective is the geometry of projection from a scene through a plane to a point or center of projection corresponding to the pupil of the viewing eye. So the perspective are lines basically from the scenery drawn through a plane to your viewing eye. If perspective is correct, the depiction on the plane will generate the same projective structure as the eye did in the scene behind it. Okay, rule 1. All straight lines in space project to straight lines or points if end on in the picture plane. So remember, we're talking about this plane that we're going to draw our picture or our photograph. This fact is a simple consequence of the geometry of projection through a point in space corresponding to the pupil of one eye. When introducing lens optics, as in the human eye, this introduces the potential for curvature in the projection. Such curvature may consequently be a property of human perception at the extrema of the field, but the laws of perspective will be considered to be those of the point projection of the pinhole optics which permit no curvature. Humans actually view scenes with two eyes, but the straight line projections in each eye are both straight lines. So the average of those two, or binocularly fused projections, is therefore a straight line. No curvature is introduced by the geometry of binocular combination. That's a big word. Rule 2. The projections of all lines that are parallel in space either remain parallel in the picture plane or intersect at a single vanishing point. So our eye sees one vanishing point. The first job in perspective projection is to identify all the lines in the scene that are parallel to a given line. Then make sure they are drawn so as to project a common vanishing point. So you're identifying all the lines in the scene that are parallel to a given line. The first set of lines will be horizontal and receding from the viewer looking straight ahead. The vanishing point for this set is directly in front of the viewer. The second set consists of any lines at right angles to the first set, thus any angle within the picture plane. This last point I wanted to make sure you understood. Perspective itself is universal, an optical projection of the light rays. Number 3, here's a good one. All sets of parallel lines lying within a specified plane in space have vanishing points that fall along the horizon line defined by the orientation of that plane. The particular case is the ground plane. All sets of parallel lines in the ground plane have vanishing points in the horizon line. And he said, note, the fact that the Earth is not flat means that it does not strictly conform to a ground plane defined geometrically. The deviation is generally too small to be of consequence in art. Rule 4. For two sets of parallel lines at some angle in the scene, the two vanishing points form that same angle at the viewer's eye, regardless of the orientation of the angle in space. Number 5, any planar figure in space is foreshortened in the direction of its slant from the observer up to a 45-degree angle. In particular, any square in the space must be foreshortened in the direction of its slant, even for the projection outside the frame up to the range defined by the vanishing points. Circles in the scene, like the sun, for example, circles in the scene, if foreshortened, project to ellipses in the picture plane. So if we were to see circles and it was because of projection, we're going to see ellipses. Rule 7. For correct projection of its perspective, a picture should be viewed from the center of projection in space. If the plane of the picture should be viewed at the angle of slant for which the perspective was designed. Other viewing angles away from the center of projection in any direction will result in perspective distortion. Notice that telephoto distortion and its limiting case, orthographic projection, conversely represent a strong magnification of the image in true perspective. The last rule, Rule 8, When the eye is at the center of projection, the perspective geometry in the picture plane is independent of where in the plane the eye is looking. Perspective is an optical transform that implies a certain projective geometry through the point in space that forms the center of the projection. Perspective is not specific to a location on the canvas, but applies throughout the pictorial space. The center of view in the picture should not be confused with the line of sight of the viewer. The center of view is the point in the picture plane closest to the viewer. The line of sight is the direction in which the viewer's eye is pointing. Okay, so some things that I was thinking about is that you can see from this video that there's a lot more to perspective than flat earthers preach about, more than meets the eye. I couldn't resist, I had to put that in. There was no mention in these rules of something like the sun moving straight across the sky at 3,000 miles, but appearing to sink below the horizon due to perspective. So I hope you got something out of this. It shows that there's no such thing as advanced perspective where the perspective lines are coming from the sun, moving down toward the horizon. That's not a thing. Perspective always are lines that focus at the eye. So, the joke of the week. A physicist sees a young man standing on the top of a tall building. You ready for this? He says, "Don't jump. You have so much potential." You might have to think about this one.